Hi there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, because that's what I am. I'm a Puppy-sensei, and I make Japanese language lessons to help you level up your abilities. As we discussed last time, this is a brand new format for these videos. How do you like the new intro? In the event that you missed my discussion of this last time, the new structure for these episodes is going to be like this. Each episode will now feature some theme where I teach you the vocabulary and grammar on some particular topic. We'll do more culture conversation as we go along, but generally my goal will be to help you improve your vocabulary recognition around a very specific topic or field. This way, if what's most helpful to you is knowing more about hospital vocabulary or samurai terms or words used in a Japanese office setting, then you can hop right to that episode and gain some insight on the field that is kind of most helpful to your goals. Of course, I'll still be doing my Wednesday grammar drop where I'll always be doing a deep dive into some very specific grammar pattern, so please use those to supplement your knowledge because I really think that those can be incredibly helpful for new learners. The other important change is that I'm no longer doing quizzes embedded in these lesson videos. Instead, I'm going to be putting out a monthly review video that will test you on all my lesson content over the course of the month. We'll see how that goes. If that needs to be revisited in the future, then we'll do that. It's no big deal, right? I'm super flexible and I hope you are too. For today, we're going to talk about Japanese gardens. I hope you have fun learning a bit about different types of gardens in Japan. I hope you get to see one day. I really do. They're pretty amazing. Well, for now, let's get into it. Ikimashou! The history of the Japanese language is a history of a beloved association with nature. I would like to read something to you. What I'm going to read to you is a translation of a Japanese preface to a poetry book. The translation I'm reading from was done by Helen McCullough, a famous scholar of pre-modern Japanese literature. The original was written by Kii no Tsuruyuki somewhere around the year 905 and was included as the preface to what would become one of the preeminent collections of Japanese poetry by a vast number of different Japanese poets. It was called the Kokin Wakashu, which translates to a collection of Japanese poems from ancient and modern times. Here is just a small segment of the preface from this poetry book. Japanese poetry has the human heart as seed and myriads of words as leaves. It comes into being when men use the seen and the heard to give voice to feelings aroused by the innumerable events in their lives. The song of the warbler among the blossoms, the voice of the frog dwelling in the water. These teach us that every living creature sings. It is song that moves heaven and earth without effort, stirs emotions in the invisible spirits and the gods, and brings harmony to the relations between men and women, and calms the hearts of fierce warriors. I think there's something really special about beginning our conversation on Japanese gardens by talking about Japanese poetry, because in a very interesting way, I somewhat believe that from a certain mindset, the Japanese garden and the Japanese poem are kind of trying to achieve the same thing. But I share this passage with you because I really want you to see that for much of Japan's history, there has been this deep appreciation for the natural world. It's part of the reason that Japan kind of ends up being seen as exhibiting this exotic and mysterious culture. At around the same time Europe was writing about Beowulf slaying dragons, Japanese poems, like this collection, right, were being written about how poetry evoked the beauty of trees and the rocks to calm the hearts of the warrior. I'm not making any kind of value judgment, and yes, I am being a little bit reductive, but my point is that from a certain point of view, it's no wonder that there's a view of Japan that exists from outsiders that kind of exemplifies the misconception that Japan is this archipelago of perfectly unspoiled natural splendor. It's not true, but that doesn't mean that there's not a whole lot of absolutely beautiful nature in Japan. So, when we talk about a Japanese garden, we should be keeping in mind that the creation of a Japanese garden hinges on a pretty simple maxim. It's the use of artifice to make the natural unnaturally look natural again. If that sentence hurts your brain to think about, don't worry, I will explain my terms. Why don't we just start by defining the word for garden in Japanese? Niwa. You've often heard me talk about how when we consider kanji, there's often a distinction in scope that we need to be really considerate of. Generally speaking, a lone kanji may actually be significantly too broad to actually hold much of a meaning on its own. It's usually through pairs of kanji, which we have been calling kanji compounds, that we're actually really able to drill down on a more specific meaning. One kanji by itself, sometimes it just means too many things. Niwa is somewhat like this. See, niwa on its own can just mean a garden, a yard, a green space. So why don't we try to better understand this kanji before we use it in a larger context? Okay, so here is niwa. As we can see, when used in some kanji compounds, it will occasionally be pronounced te, as in ko-te, which is like a school green space, perhaps something like the central courtyard of a school or a campus. When we see this kanji, we're frequently going to want to think about a green space of some kind, right? Anywhere that you see niwa or te, it's going to have grass or plants or usually, but not always, intentionally cultivated vegetation of some kind. Niwa has 3 radicals. So we see the radical meaning, a house on a cliff. And then we see the radical meaning, a long walk or a long stride. And then finally we see this one, which can mean something like royalty, is also kind of closely related to the radical that means jade. Niwa appears in a ton of kanji compounds, ranging from those that relate to gardening to words like kate, which can mean something like your household or a hearth. For today, in our effort to best understand the culture of Japanese gardening, we need to learn the following word. Nihon teien, a Japanese garden. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time actually breaking these kanji down because 3 out of 4 of them you should already know with no hesitation whatsoever. Because, well, I just taught you niwa, and the other 2, of course, are nihon, and nihon means Japan. And then teien is a garden. So how is teien different from niwa? They both mean garden, but remember, a lone kanji can be very broad. Right? Niwa is very, very, very broad, but teien is literally a garden park. In other words, niwa is to teien as grocery is to grocery store. A teien is a cultivated garden space, and the field of Nihon teien in itself is an entire scholarly art. We don't have time to cover everything that there is to know about Japanese gardens in just one lesson, so for today, I'm going to teach you 3 essential elements of a Japanese garden, and then I'll teach you some other common elements of Japanese gardens, just kind of things that you'll commonly find in Japanese gardens, and then we're going to do a quick bit of grammar work. Look how organized I'm getting! I'm providing you a whole roadmap for the lesson. Are you proud of me? All Japanese gardens, almost without exception, are going to have some type of plant, some type of rock or boulder or stone or rock structure, and lastly, water. These are the three most important elements necessary for a Japanese garden. Now, there are, there are exceptions to this rule, right? There are Japanese dry gardens, for example, that may not have any plants in them whatsoever. But generally speaking, for it to be a Japanese garden, it's going to need to have plants, rocks, and water. Okay, so let's learn some vocabulary. First, shokubutsu. Shokubutsu is a word in Japanese that means plant or plant life. It's literally a plant thing. That first kanji is the verb meaning to plant something or to cultivate vegetation. And then the second kanji is a thing. So shokubutsu can mean something like a planted thing, right? We want to compare this to dobutsu. Dobutsu is a word that means a moving thing or an animal. Shokubutsu is a rooted thing or a plant. So, what kinds of plant life are you actually likely to see in a Japanese garden? I'm not going to go through any kind of entire list because it would just take forever, but I'll talk about some of the most common types of trees and flowers that you're going to see in a Japanese garden, just like the following. Kaede. Japanese maple trees. Yeah, that's kaede. These trees have this really beautiful, deep reddish purple colored leaves, and they have a really distinctive leaf shape. Personally, I think they are very beautiful, even though I think most people who travel to Japan vastly prefer the beauty of sakura. Sakura are cherry blossom trees. I'm sure that you've seen them all over. They're extremely, extremely, extremely popular, and everybody really loves them. And I'm not saying that they're not beautiful. They really, really, really are. They're delicate and gorgeous and amazing. Their pink flowers are nationally beloved for their touching and delicate beauty. Sakura trees exemplify the Japanese concept of aware. Aware is the idea that things are actually more beautiful because they fade with time. The fact that their time is limited makes them more beautiful. Because the blossoming season for sakura is really quite brief, they are considered a treasure because the amount of time that we have to appreciate them is actually so limited. I want to tell you something really cool about the kanji for sakura. Well, I mean, I think it's really cool. You might not, but I'm going to tell you anyway, and you're a captive audience, so you have to listen to me. When it comes to Japanese names, there's a fairly common standard for women's names. Although the standard for men's names is significantly less restrictive. Men's names can be any length, for example, but women's names are almost always 3 or fewer syllables, right? Shorter names are considered cuter for girls in Japan. Common female names in Japan include Aiko, Hina, Kumiko, Chio. See, they're all quite short, 2, maybe 3 syllables, okay? So, a lot of Japanese female names also are going to end in ko, which is the character for small or cute or childlike, just like Kumiko that I said before, right? With that in mind, because sakura blossoms are so very well loved in Japan, there is a name, Sakurako. Sakurako. And it's a pretty popular name for girls in Japan, especially if they're born in March, April, May, which is cherry blossom season. But Sakurako also breaks the convention for girl name equals short name. It's 4 syllables, which is, it's not unheard of in Japan, but it's like just weird enough that I have known girls who were bullied in school because, haha, long name, that's not cute. I don't know. I think it's funny and interesting, and I personally think that the name Sakurako is really, really beautiful. But, I've also known women who are named Kaede, so, I think the convention of naming girls after trees and flowers and things that are beautiful and cute, it's definitely something to think about. Anyway, back to plants. Sugi wa sugi desu! Okay, nobody got that joke, XS. Okay, a sugi is specifically a Japanese cedar. It's a beautiful pine type tree, and I actually love them. Pine trees and evergreen trees are my favorite kinds of trees, and you will find them in great supply in Japanese gardens. Why is that? Well, it's because they kind of stand in for forests, right? Japanese gardens love to kind of emulate other kind of larger landscapes in nature, and a single sugi can kind of stand in as a forest in kind of a larger landscape miniaturization, right? That's something that's very, very important in Japanese gardens, and I think that's quite cool. All right, let's talk about a few of the common flower types that you're often going to see in Japanese gardens. You'll usually see a lot of flowers, and they may be used in that same way, where they're meant to kind of evoke other aspects of a landscape, of a larger landscape. Do you remember the word just for flower? I taught it to you a long time ago, so I hope you remember. It's hana. This is actually one of the very first words that I taught in my lessons, so yeah, it's a really good one to know. Hana. If you don't know how to write this kanji, you should probably try to memorize it because it's important. Remember, hana can also mean your nose. Different kanji, same pronunciation. The kanji is totally different, so don't really get them confused, but the pronunciation is the same. But yeah, flowers and your nose. They go together, because smell, right? I guess? Anyway, let's talk about specific flowers now. So, a botan. A botan. I actually don't really know all that much about peonies. They like water. I know that. That's really about all I know about them. I mean, they're colorful. I don't know. I like trees more than flowers, okay? Kiku! Kiku desu! Kiku are chrysanthemums. Chrysanthemum flowers are a symbol of the imperial house in Japan. And if you've ever seen this symbol, it's the Japanese imperial crest. It's supposed to symbolize the chrysanthemum flower, right? You can kind of see the similarity, I guess. I actually have a really funny story about the word kiku, but it's not entirely safe for work, so I don't really want to get into it here, but I suppose if you really want to know about it, ask me in the comments. I'm not shy, and it really is a funny story filled with adventure and miscommunication. It's just a little bit risque. I mean, I'm pretty say so, but you know. Anyway, another very important flower in Japanese gardens is the Fuji. It's another one that's very important, not just because it's used in Japanese gardens, but also because it's kind of historically interesting. Wisteria, the Fuji flower, is an important flower that shows up a lot in the Tale of Genji. If you've been listening to me read the Tale of Genji on Irium, then you might remember that Fuji shows up in Fujitsubo. Yeah. But even more interesting to me, because I really love Japanese history and I really hate Genji, the Fujiwara family. The Fujiwara family uses this same kanji, right? This Fuji, ne? The Fuji from Wisteria is in Fujiwara. And the Fujiwara family was an extremely influential family that kind of served as the power behind the throne during a lot of the Heian period in Japanese history. You're really frequently going to see these flowers in Japanese gardens, these wisteria flowers, these Fuji, and they're used to kind of evoke the feel of winter, right? So I talked about how Japanese gardens oftentimes are used to kind of mimic nature. Well, wisteria can kind of look like cascading snow. So if you put them next to a pine tree, it sort of looks like maybe a forest with some snow kind of etched onto the side of it. And that can be really beautiful, right? I should probably just mention that the word for rose in Japanese is bara, but bara aren't exactly a staple of more traditional Japanese gardens. I mean, you see them from time to time. Also, usually you just write bara in katakana, so really no need to learn this kanji. My personal favorite flower is the tsubaki. I think tsubaki are perfectly beautiful. It's the camellia flower. Also, I kind of really like the kanji for tsubaki. I don't know, it just gives me like a calm springtime feel. Okay, we've talked a lot about plant life, but I also said that Japanese gardens almost always employ rocks, right? Now, I've been talking about how Japanese gardens evoke the sense of the natural world. Rocks are really commonly kind of a stand in for mountains, right? So you place a rock really strategically in a Japanese garden to kind of give the feel that there's a mountain rising out that you can kind of see and appreciate. So let's talk just a little bit about rocks, okay? So in Japanese gardens, you're going to see a lot of ishi, stones. Ishi is the kanji that means a stone. In a Japanese garden, like I said, stones evoke this idea of a mountain. And although I've kind of been dancing around this a little bit, what I want to kind of cement is that in a Japanese garden, you frequently have the design that's supposed to be a miniature version of some larger landscape. And what's the point behind that? The point is that you can enjoy a Japanese garden from two different perspectives. From one perspective, you can be down in it. You can be walking through the garden and you can say, oh, there's that tree that I like. Oh, there's that flower that I like. Oh, this is all very enjoyable. I'm walking through this path and having a really lovely time. But you can also stand back away from the garden and look at the garden from afar and say, wow, the design of that garden is kind of evoking the sense of the natural world. It sort of looks like a larger landscape, as if I were standing on a mountain looking down and enjoying a view of a forest or a mountain range or something like that, right? And so this is also something that you're going to see a lot in those Zen gardens, which are sometimes called dry gardens. Zen gardens are often designed in such a way that they look like deserts. That's why I said before, sometimes, but not always, you might have these dry gardens, these Zen gardens, that don't have maybe any plant life, maybe don't have any water, because it's kind of meant to evoke a desert. And sometimes boulders, like ishi, are going to be standing in for mountains rising out of the sand. Yeah? Okay. Finally, most Japanese gardens are going to have some kind of water feature. Perhaps that's going to be an ike, a pond. Ponds are very, very common in Japanese gardens, often with a bountiful number of koi fish. And as you go to kind of feed them, they'll be, you know, coming up to the surface and looking at you and going, ba, 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 please feed me, please give me something. It's not really because they're starving, it's usually just because there are tons of them and they're kind of competing, right? Another thing that you're often going to find in Japanese gardens are taki. Taki, that's not a rolled up chip. Taki are waterfalls in Japanese. Taki. Ne? I also like this kanji. I think this kanji just kind of evokes a sense of beauty to me. But anyway, waterfalls are often cultivated in Japanese gardens in a way that they kind of provide a sense of movement and a pleasing ambiance as you move through the garden, right? They can also be used to great effect to sort of give the idea of a river moving through your garden, right? And they may be giving off a sound that sort of sounds like the sound of a river lapping against, the side of the shore or something like that. Yeah. Sometimes in a garden, you might have like a much bigger garden, and maybe it's even too big to incorporate a pond, so it might incorporate a mizuumi. Mizuumi, ne? That sounds like water plus sea, but that's different. Mizuumi is a lake, right? Mizuumi, just this kanji. Lakes in Japanese gardens are often framed in such a way so that they specifically create reflections. And so that creates the sense that the beauty of the plants reaching skyward ends up getting mirrored in the clarity of the unrippled waters below. Believe me, it evokes a pretty gorgeous image. I don't know that this picture really does all that much justice to it, but you get the idea. It's incredibly beautiful. I remember when I was in Tokyo and I went to the separated palace, and it has this lake that just captures the trees so perfectly in these clear waters, and on a beautiful blue sky day, it's just a gorgeous image. Now, if those are the three most common and arguably most necessary aspects of a Nihon Teien, right? It's plant life and rocks and water, all meant to evoke kind of a miniaturized version of the natural world. Then there are a few other things that you also might stumble across in a Japanese garden. While every Japanese garden kind of sort of needs to have plants and rocks and water, you might also see things like ishidoro, ne? These are stone lanterns that are a really common fixture in Japanese gardens. They're a bunch of different types and a bunch of different shapes, but I think that, this is kind of an iconic look at what they look like. Yeah. I think that their purpose has a lot more to do with creating a sense of harmony than they do actually providing a light source. You don't usually go to a Japanese garden at night anyway, so, you rarely see these things lit unless there's some kind of like festival or event going on where it's necessary to sort of slide a candle in there. But, generally speaking, they just sort of give off this, I don't know, like a rooted sense, almost a landmark or something that you can point to and say, well, take a left there at that ishidoro, that stone lantern. Yeah. You'll also sometimes see tsuridoro, a hanging lantern. Hanging lanterns are usually much more associated with temples and shrines than they are with gardens, but you will occasionally see these in gardens, sure, yeah, absolutely. And also sometimes you're going to find that temples and gardens will share spaces. Sometimes you'll have a temple and a garden right next to one another. Sometimes you might have a temple right there in the garden itself. So, these things are still a little bit related. So even though a tsuridoro is much more associated normally with a temple or a shrine, that doesn't mean that it's not something that you wouldn't see in a garden. Okay, a couple more vocabulary words that I want to introduce you to. Two more things that I really associate with Japanese gardens really, really commonly. Hashi. Hashi are bridges. I am a really big fan of bridges. I love them. So bridges are called hashi in Japanese, but be careful because hashi is also how you pronounce the word for chopsticks. No relation, different kanji, just like hana and hana, right? Hashi can mean chopsticks, but it also means bridges when this kanji is used. Bridges in Japan can take a lot of forms, and I think a lot of Japanese bridges are extremely beautiful. Sometimes Japanese bridges have a little bit of a dark history. That's something else that I'll get into in the future. But the most iconic type of Japanese bridge is a curved bridge like this one. Trust me when I say these bridges are way more steep than you think they are. Like, I've seen so many pictures of them, but my first time actually, like, standing in front of one, I was like, how? How did they get things up and over this bridge? They're, like, really steep. Okay, one last really common thing that you're going to find in a Japanese garden. This is a sozu. You've probably heard one before, right? You hear them a lot in anime. Or maybe you've seen one, or maybe both, maybe... Manager-sama, do the noise again. I need that for my stream deck. Anyway, did you learn a lot of vocabulary? Let's do a little bit of grammar work, okay? One of the things that I've taught you today is that Japanese gardens are almost always cultivated and designed in such a way that they're kind of meant to resemble actual landscapes. What I want to teach you today are some ways to compare two or more things in Japanese. So we're going to learn a grammar pattern that allows you to say this thing is like this thing, or when you're comparing this thing, this is more like this than that, right? So we're going to learn the verb to compare, kuraberu. This verb is kuraberu. It basically means to compare things. You can use it to compare two things. You can use it to compare more than two things. Can you tell what type of verb it is? Is this an ichidan verb or a godan verb? Think about it for just a second. So it's kuraberu. It ends in ru, which means it's a ru verb, right? Yeah, and that also means that it's going to conjugate with this pattern. So kuraberu is the plain non-past, meaning to compare. The polite form would be kurabemasu. Yeah, it works the same way as taberu. Taberu becomes tabemasu. Kuraberu becomes kurabemasu. And then the plain past would be kurabeta. The polite past would be kurabemashita. The continuative form, to compare and also to do something else, this is probably the most important form for the verb kuraberu because it's the one you're going to use most often, and that's kurabete. Kurabete. Very, very important. We're going to talk a lot about kurabete today. And then the negative non-past, to not compare, would be kurabenai, right? Okay. So that's a pretty simple conjugation pattern, of course. Yeah, it just follows the basic rules for any other ichidan verb, just like the verb taberu, which is a verb that we've talked about a whole lot. But you might also be wondering how exactly you go about using the kurabere verb to compare two things, right? Because in my humble opinion, it doesn't feel immediately straightforward. How do you use kuraberu and you're going to use it to compare two things, right? So let's consider some example sentences, and then we're going to define some really additional rules for drawing comparisons in Japanese. All right, here's our first example sentence. 東京に比べて京都はたくさん庭があります。東京に比べて京都はたくさん庭があります。This is also really true. Compared to Tokyo, Kyoto really does have a lot of gardens. It's generally considered the case that Kyoto is a more garden, temple, shrine-heavy city compared to the extremely industrial Tokyo. If you have the chance to visit Japan, I'm always going to recommend Kyoto if you're really into things like hiking, exploring nature, or digging into Japanese history. For me, that's my whole thing, right? And so I love going to Kyoto. Tokyo doesn't do it for me, right? It does it for a lot of people. A lot of people love Tokyo, but Tokyo, it's great if you're into like big cities and shopping and that bustling, energetic, constant activity type feel, right? I think of Tokyo as being a great place to party and Kyoto as being a great place to kind of relax and look at temples and shrines and gardens and be more in touch with the natural world. Yeah, it's just sort of my take on it. But anyway, if we look at this sentence, we can kind of start to see how this kuraberu is used, right? This is a pretty standard use case for kuraberu. So, Tokyo ni kurabete. See, I told you kurabete was going to be something that we would talk about today, right? Tokyo ni kurabete Kyoto wa takusan niwa ga arimasu. Yeah. Okay, so how does this break down? The use of kuraberu is really frequently going to look something like this. So we'll have a noun, ni kurabete, and then we'll have a second noun, wa, and then we'll have some fact that is more true about the second noun than it is about the first noun. Using this pattern, we can say things like, that teacher is more experienced than this one. This type of food is tastier than that other type of food. Or that mountain is much prettier than this other one. Generally speaking, when you're using kuraberu to compare two things, you can almost always count on placing the ni particle between the first noun and the kurabete, right? That ni kurabete pattern is something that you can really count on. You can almost always think of ni kurabete as a set unit that's kind of almost always going to be used together. The French case that proves the exception to the rule is when you're using kuraberu as an active verb to talk about the fact that you are doing the act of comparison, right? You are comparing things. So if you said, "What are you doing right now?" and the answer was, "I'm comparing some stuff," then you wouldn't use this ni kurabete kind of set pattern. So here's a case of that, right? 今、この植物の高さを比べる。今、この植物の高さを比べる。Do you see what I mean in this case? Here, I am not comparing two things using ni kurabete. ね? I've marked kuraberu with the verb o, right? And the object of my sentence is the height of the plants. The object is the height of the plants. The active verb is doing comparison, right? Okay. Right, that's because I'm using the verb compare to describe what I'm doing. I'm doing comparison, but I'm not using ni kurabete to compare two things grammatically. So in that case, we do not follow that set pattern of ni kurabete that we normally see when we're drawing a comparison between two or more things. I want to look at another case, and we're going to talk about something that happens really frequently in spoken Japanese. Not so often in written Japanese, I would say incredibly rare in written Japanese, but it happens a lot in spoken Japanese. And again, this is more evidence that sometimes it's hard to sort of pick out just from writing what's really going on in the Japanese language, because we have things like this, right? Look at this sentence. 海に比べて私の庭にある池は小さいです。繰り返してください. I'm going to have you repeat after me for this sentence. 海に比べて私の庭にある池は小さいです。海に比べて私の庭にある池は小さいです。Okay, so 私の庭にある池, the pond in my garden, right? And then 海に比べて compared to the ocean. Compared to the ocean, the pond in my garden feels very small. That's kind of an extremely obvious sentence, isn't it? Right? It absolutely is very obvious. Of course, my little pond is much smaller than the ocean, right? But there's something else that I really want to draw your attention to aside from the obviousness of this little sentence, right? And that's the fact that something interesting happens when we drop the front part, right? If we drop umi ni kurabete, what are we left with? We're left with 私の庭にある池は小さいです. The pond in my garden is small. Did you notice that 私の庭にある池は小さいです is itself a full, complete, whole sentence? That's just a sentence. That's just a statement. It's a statement that the pond that I have in my garden is small. And this is really always going to be the case for anything that follows that ni kurabete pattern, right? This can be a really helpful way to think about drawing comparisons in Japanese. Really, what you're doing is you're making a simple truth claim. This thing is true. My garden is small. My friend is short. My phone is crappy. This food is delicious. You're making some simple statement, simple truth, right? One thing is true, and in doing so, you're going to create a whole sentence. One sentence that makes some statement. But that ni kurabete segment is something that we want to add on simply to provide some additional context into which that truth fits. Sure, my phone is crappy. Compared to what? Compared to brand new phones that just came out. But not necessarily compared to like a phone from the 2000s, right? That there would be no comparison there, right? And so we need the context of kurabete to say under what circumstance is this thing true. And I think that what is really sort of cool that happens a lot in spoken Japanese is that we can actually swap the positions of the truth statement and the kurabete, the thing that we're comparing it to. So, right, we can swap these around, just like this sentence above. We could say, 私の庭にある池は小さいです。海に比べて。ね? But technically speaking, this isn't a perfectly grammatical sentence, right? 私の庭にある池は小さいです。海に比べて。Remember, in the very strict sense for a Japanese sentence, your verb should be at the end, especially if it's the main verb. And while kuraberu is a verb, kurabete is not the main verb in this sentence, and it's definitely not conjugated as the main verb in the sentence because it's ending in that te form, right? If it were going to be the main verb in the sentence, it would probably end in something like a mas form. And yet, you actually really do hear this phrase structure quite a lot in Japanese. Why? Because sometimes people think about drawing a comparison after the fact. They start talking and they say, oh, well, this thing is true. And then they think, oh, right. That's only true within this certain very specific context, right? So, as an example, sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, that movie was so cool. And then as soon as you say that, you remember that the movie Jaws exists. And then you're like, oh, well, yeah, this movie isn't nearly as cool as Jaws, right? Jaws is much better than this movie. So while I think that movie was cool, it's not as cool as Jaws and some of the older movies that have existed, like Jurassic Park, which is the best movie ever made, right? So then as you're talking and you say, oh, that movie is really cool, you have to think, oh, but, is it as cool as older movies, or maybe it's only cool within the context of movies that have come out recently? So maybe what I really wanted to say was, this movie is more cool than most recent movies. So, in Japanese, we could say a sentence like that as, この映画はかっこいい。最近の映画に比べて。ね。この映画はかっこいい。最近の映画に比べて。It's like you start making a claim and then you realize that, heck, yeah, that's only true within the scope of some certain idea in the world, and so you have to clarify. There's another small nuance with kuraberu that I really want to draw your attention to, right? So, here's another sentence. 桜に比べて松は緑色です。This is pretty basic and pretty easy to understand sentence, right? It's a pretty normal ni kurabete kind of sentence. Sakura ni kurabete matsu, pine trees, wa midori iro desu, in a green color, the color of green. Pine trees are more green than sakura trees. Yeah? The nuance that I want to show you here is so small that it really almost amounts to nothing, but it's something that you see often enough, and it's kind of an interchange in the Japanese language that you will see from time to time, even though the meaning is almost exactly the same. So I want you to compare these two sentences. Sakura ni kuraberu to matsu wa midori iro desu. Do you see what we've changed here? We've exchanged ni kurabete with ni kuraberu to. Basically, instead of using that ni kurabete, we're going to replace it with that ni kuraberu to. Ni kuraberu to. Ne? You want to make sure that that's in the plain form. It's not conjugated. It's in the plain form, kuraberu. As I said, these sentences really are almost perfectly identical in Japanese. The difference is basically that kurabete is in the continuative form so that it can link two sentences together, while the second sentence uses the base non-past verb, kuraberu, plus the particle to, which we can sometimes use to mean when one does this verb, something else happens, right? This follows in some ways, right? And so sometimes you're just going to see these used interchangeably. Ni kurabete and ni kuraberu to. Do they mean anything particularly different? No, not really, not really. So why use one over the other? It can just sometimes come down to preference or which one sounds better or something like that, right? Likewise, we can sometimes replace the ni particle with to, and once again, it's almost a purely identical meaning. So here's an example sentence. 動物園と比べると枯山水は超穏やかです。繰り返してください。動物園と比べると枯山水は超穏やかです。動物園と比べると枯山水は超穏やかです。I mean, I love zoos. I really love zoos. And I've been to some very calm zoos where the animals are just like, yo, I'm chill. We're just hanging out. It's fine. But yeah, I think Zen gardens are like an entirely different quality. Like they're tranquil to a whole other level. Like Zenyatta levels of tranquility. Inner peace. Inner peace. I just can't stay calm. Did you enjoy learning all about Japanese gardens a little bit? I want to remind you that this wasn't anywhere near how much I really could have said about Japanese gardens at all. There's just so much to learn and so much to think about. They're interesting and they're complicated and they're artistic and they're beautiful and I think that they're a lot of fun. Heck, we didn't even get into the prevalence of different types of architecture in Japanese gardens and tea houses. I smell a sequel in the future. In 2 weeks, for our next video in this series, I'm going to do a lesson on bungo. That's a pre-modern Japanese literary form. It's kind of like the type of Japanese that you would need to be able to read if you wanted to read something like The Tale of Genji or old literature from around the Heian period, something like that. This is a grammatical style of Japanese that was used in literature, but today has almost entirely fallen out of use. You know, most people really, even in Japan, kind of can't read bungo. I wouldn't call it a dead language exactly, but it definitely fits into the category of languages that are really no longer used or recognized. Still, I think it's super interesting, and knowing it honestly really kind of helps you understand more about modern Japanese grammar because you sort of get to see and learn the history of how the grammar evolved over time, which is pretty cool. What we're not going to get into during my bungo lesson is kuzushiji, which is kind of like the literary Japanese equivalent of cursive writing. Conventional wisdom says that you probably should not try to start learning to read kuzushiji until you've been studying the Japanese language for about a decade. That's not a rule or anything, it's just that reading kuzushiji is friggin' difficult. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to seeing you again soon. You're all wonderful, and you get a gold star for the day. I am so proud that you're all my students. I'll see you soon. Mata ne!